So my name is Chistopher Scholefield. I'm one of the advocates of the Royal Court of Jersey, and I was called to the Jersey Bar in this room back in 1987, so I'm getting on for as old as some of the events which you saw depicted in the film. And you find yourself now in the space where those events happened. Not the self-same room, because that has been changed, but this space on God's earth was where it actually happened a quarter of a millennium ago, that the corn riots took place. Now, could I just ask you by a quick show of hands to indicate if you have never been in this room before? So there's quite a lot of explaining to be done about where you find yourself, but I'd like to begin by pointing out this detail, which is that a court is not a space or a room, it's actually a body of people. The court normally sits here, but as we know as Jersey folk, on the Visite Royale, the court climbs into limousines and tours a parish whose highways and byways are being inspected. And also it's possible for the court to go out on a visit. So in a case where I was defending somebody once of having received stolen goods, which were said to have been hidden in his attic, the court actually drove out to the scene of the crime in order to inspect the premises and actually get a feeling for whether he could possibly have been genuinely ignorant of the fact that the goods had been hidden there. Because he claimed, yes, they were found in my attic, but I didn't know they were there. And here's the trapdoor whereby the attic could have been reached from the public highway, and so the goods hidden there without my knowing. So a court is a bunch of people, not a room necessarily, but this is the base, this is the headquarters of the Royal Court of Jersey, the island's principal court. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain who does what and where they sit and how trials happen, and a little bit more about some of the pictures and furnishings and fittings of this courtroom which we're fortunate enough to be able to use here in Jersey. And then try and explain how those events that you saw in the video actually came to change significantly the nature of the work done in this court, and actually to make it a bit more fair and a bit more equitable. So, there are two seats behind the royal mace, which was given to the island of Jersey by Charles II after Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth had been terminated, to thank the island, and in particular the de Carteret family, for looking after him when he was on the run after the Royalists lost the English Civil War. The chair on the right is where the bailiff sits, so the bailiff in the time of the film was, of course, Charles Lompriere. Now, in fact, Sir George de Carteret, who had helped Charles II and been rewarded not only with the gift of the mace for the island, but also with lands in North America, which became the state of New Jersey, it was his great-grandson who was the bailiff at the time of the corn riots, because the office of bailiff had become hereditary. But his great-grandson was a very capable person, and he was busy carving a career for himself in politics in London, where he was a member of the cabinet of Horace Walpole, who was widely regarded as the first ever Prime Minister in the British political system. So he left the work to be done by a lieutenant, and that lieutenant was Charles Lompriere. And in Balane's History of Jersey, that is described as the dictatorship of Charles Lompriere. So you can see that he was doing things pretty much his own way. In court, there is also a seat for the Lieutenant Governor, but at the time, as we heard, he was an ineffectual person by the name of Ball, who was compared to an oyster. Next to him are the seats of the 12 jurats, or magistrates, as they were described in the film. Now, the important distinction is that the bailiff, in a dispute or a court case, is the judge of law, whereas the jurats are the judges of fact. So when it comes down to a question of what the law actually means, the bailiff decides. When it comes down to a question of which witness to believe, the jurats decide. There's one important exception to that, and that is that in a criminal case, if it is a crime which has long been forbidden as a matter of Jersey's customary law, then the accused has the right to be tried at an assize by a jury. That's a group of 12 members of the public. If it's a statutory offence, something more recent and more modern, such as a breach of the drugs laws, then the accused does not have that right. and he will be tried by the jurors. Now I'm going to let you into a secret as a defence advocate. We lawyers much prefer to have our clients tried by a jury, because it's much easier to try and persuade 12 people that they too could perhaps have made the mistake that your client has made, or perhaps be misunderstood, or things to appear not quite as they seem, than it is to persuade 2 jurors who've seen so many cases already, and who are familiar with all counsel's little tricks and ruses and verbal mannerisms. So we like, if we can, to have an audience of 12 rather than just an audience of 2 for the tribunal of fact. When the jury is sitting, they sit in these benches behind me, and we have come into court halfway through an actual assize case which is going on at the moment. So you can see their highlighted pens because they're going through documentation which has been made available as part of the background to the case. The case is presented for the prosecution by the Attorney General, or perhaps the Solicitor General, or a member of their team, and he sits over there. The defence sits over there, and you can see that conveniently, right behind him, there's a little space for the accused to sit in a sort of cage, and he has a little doorway that leads him directly back to the cells, where he has to cool his heels after arriving from Lamoy and before the case gets started. Now, I'm talking as though every case dealt with in this court were a criminal case, but that's not necessarily so. Criminal cases are where the authorities want you to come and answer for your behaviour because they believe you've committed a crime. If it's a small crime, you'd be before the magistrate in the magistrate's court next to Cyril Marker House. A more important crime will be dealt with in the royal court. If your sentence could be for more than 4 years, the court sits with 5 jurats at least to decide what your sentence should be. So if there has been an assize trial, the role of the jurats, since the decision on fact was taken by the jury, will be to decide what the penalty should be. And unlike in England, the Attorney General is allowed to suggest a particular penalty, and the job of the defence is to offer, if the accused has been found guilty, all the reasons why that penalty would be too harsh, and why the court should remember the value and the quality of mercy. Please not be so hard on my client, who had a very difficult childhood. And you could imagine all the other hearts and flowers that get mentioned on such an occasion. But in civil cases, you will find the 2 lawyers for the plaintiff and the defendant sitting in that front row there, often with their client immediately behind them. And I can tell you that those benches are unbelievably uncomfortable, and that these little desks here are just the right width so that a full ring binder of papers will topple onto your lap constantly. So it's beautiful, but it's inconvenient. Now, one of the aspects of the beauty of this court are the pictures which we are surrounded by. And the first one I'd like to draw to your attention is the one behind you, which is a copy of The Death of Major Pearson. The original was painted in 1793, 2 years after the battle, and hangs in the Tate in London. That copy was made in 1866, by which time the original had become rather dirty, because being in London, in those days everybody heated their houses with coal fires. The atmosphere was dreadful, the painting over the decades had got grubby, and they painted the painting as they saw it by then, grubby. So there's a lot of details missing. There's one thing which we've lost in particular, which is on the original you can see the royal arms more clearly over the front door to the court. But if you look, you can see the statue of the king, which is still present in the royal square today. And if you're eagle-eyed, you can see up on the left where Fort Regent is, the dolmen, which was later removed from that spot and taken to the gardens of a house in Henley-on-Thames in England, Park Place, which became the most expensive private residence in England, so naturally it belongs to a Russian oligarch. Finally, those of you with children in particular will want to take a close look at Major Pearson, who's in the centre of the picture, and look how very white his face is, just to make it clear to us that he is well and truly dead. The second picture doesn't require much explanation. It is this very courtroom in 1897 during the course of an assize d'héritage, which is these days an annual sitting of the court when the seigneurs come to confirm that they're still in possession of their fiefs, and the advocates, such as myself, come to renew their oaths of office. The other old picture I would like to mention is the one above the door leading to the criminal cells, because that is a picture of Marshal Conway, who was the Lieutenant Governor of the island in 1772. So after Bentinck, who was mentioned in the film, made such a good job of being Lieutenant Governor, they decided to send another highly competent ex-military man who achieved the rank of Marshal, and that was Conway, and so they named Conway Street after him. In those days, the fashion or the custom was to wear only one epaulette on one shoulder, not two epaulettes on both shoulders, and that picture is a Gainsborough. So that's one of the most valuable things in this room. The other things I'd like to mention are all bailiffs from the 20th century. So if we go up there to the corner, we've got Sir William Venables Vernon, and there's a very nice story about him. So he was bailiff shortly after the Great War and in the early 1920s. At that stage, the government in London was virtually bankrupted by the cost of having fought the Great War. So they sent a commission to the Crown dependencies of Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man asking for money. Sort of demands with menaces, but polite menaces. Would you like to pay money to the London government to help us meet the gap in our savings because of the cost of fighting the war? And they were well received in Guernsey, where a senior official with a marvellously donkey name, Sir Haviland de Sommeray, received them and agreed that Guernsey would write them a big fat cheque. Then they got back on the steamer and came onto St Helier, and they were met by a leading jurat, Jurat Lampriere, who made all sorts of encouraging noises until the then bailiff, Sir William Venable Vernon, entered the scene and said, no, or perhaps no. We are not going to break the long-standing constitutional rule that Jersey does not pay tax to the United Kingdom under any circumstances. So the Commission of Inquiry, together with their demands with discreet menaces, were sent away by him with a flea in their ear. And so I like to think of him as the godfather of the finance industry. Up there, next to the clock, is of course Lord Coutances, who was bailiff of Jersey during the German occupation, Alexander Coutances, subsequently ennobled. Although, of course, they say that Winston Churchill said shortly after the liberation, I don't know whether to hang him as a collaborator or to ennoble him for having protected the island. Happily for him, and in fact, in all fairness, he was made a lord because of the work he'd done in trying to mitigate the pressure on the local population of the German occupation. Up there, above the door through which you'll be shortly travelling, is Cecil Harrison. He was bailiff of Jersey, but shortly in the 1950s, shortly before he became bailiff, he appeared on behalf of the island, together with a lawyer from London, in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, when Jersey and France went to court over whether the Ecrahos and the Minkies belonged to us or to them. And he appeared to argue Jersey's case. The English lawyer was in his black robes, the judges of the International Court of Justice were in black, and he was resplendent in the red robes of the Jersey Attorney General, and entertained the court with lots of stories about fishing expeditions to the Minkies as a boy. So clearly they must belong to Jersey. And then there we have a small picture between the two larger ones, Sir Peter Krill, who was bailiff when I was called to the bar, and who was of course one of three young men, as he was then, who escaped from Jersey during the occupation to join liberated France as it had become after June 1944. So those are the principal features of this court and what happens here. But the bit I want to finish by saying is to underline the importance of what happened as a result of the Corn Riots. Because in common with lots of assemblies across France, which Jersey in many ways mirrored, this organisation, the Royal Court, was a parlement. Now, we English speakers often think, well, parlement must in English mean a parliament. But it doesn't. It meant something very different. To the people of the 18th century, it meant a place where the law was administered and made. To them, it seemed perfectly logical that you should do the same thing, both things, in one organisation. Administer the law and declare what the law is. They weren't thinking in terms of the super topical issue of the separation of powers between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And that's super topical, because Boris Johnson, on behalf of the executive, is having a battle royal with the legislature over whether or not he has the right to prorogue the Parliament of Westminster. So the separation of powers is hugely important. And because of the Corn Riots, and because of the reforms that flowed from that, it arrived here too. See, at the time, as was explained, the states of Jersey existed, but they were completely subservient to the royal court. They were called upon by the bailiff when he felt the need for a bit of input as to what the law should be from people who had some idea of what the population at large thought. So the states were subservient to the court, and as a result of the riots, that changed. And we got the separation of powers in Jersey so that the states made the law and the court administered the law. That was the beginning of a modern and fair constitution. And guess what? We did that in 1771, before the French had their revolution, before the Americans had their revolution. We in Jersey, we led the way. We're marvellous. So that's what I've got to tell you about the Royal Court. I'm going to hand you over now to the State's Greffier, Lisa Hart, who will explain what goes on next door amongst the politicians. And if you think the lawyers are bad, wait till you hear what they do.